You didn't plan to end up here. That's the first thing you want people to understand. You weren't a spy. You weren't a journalist trying to expose anything. You were an aid worker. 29 years old, fresh out of a humanitarian organization based in Geneva, assigned to a food distribution program operating through an officially sanctioned channel in Pyongyang. You had the paperwork. You had the visas. You had the official government minders who walked beside you every day like shadows that had learned to smile. You followed every rule. You bowed when you were supposed to bow. You said nothing that wasn't carefully pre-approved by the organization's legal team back in Switzerland. On your 43rd day in the country, you took a photograph. Not of a military installation, not of a government building, not of anything you would have thought twice about back home. You photographed an old woman sitting on the steps of a crumbling building, eating rice from a bowl. That was it. That was the crime. She was maybe 70 years old, and her hands were the hands of someone who had worked every day of her life, and the light was hitting the side of her face in a way that made her look like a painting. And you were an aid worker who had spent 6 years documenting poverty and hunger across 4 continents, and this was exactly the kind of image that told the truth about what you were seeing. A human being, eating, surviving. You raised your camera and you pressed the button, and the shutter clicked and the moment was captured, and you felt the specific satisfaction of a photograph that says something real. You did not know that photographing ordinary North Korean citizens without explicit written state permission is a criminal act. You did not know that an image of an elderly woman eating rice from a bowl on a public step could be classified as defaming the dignity of the North Korean people and distributing anti-state propaganda. You did not know that the man standing across the street, who appeared to be reading a newspaper, had been watching you for 3 days and had photographed you taking the photograph. Your minder confiscated your camera that evening. He smiled when he did it. The minder never came back. 2 hours later, 4 men in uniforms came through the door of your room, and none of them spoke English, and you were put in a vehicle with blacked-out windows, and you have not seen the outside of a building since. That was 14 months ago. The prison is called Facility 7 by the guards. You know this because one of the prisoners, a man named Kang, spent 3 weeks teaching you enough Korean to survive before he disappeared one morning and nobody would tell you where he went. You still think about Kang. You think about him the way you think about a door that was open and is now closed. He was the first person in this place who treated you like a human being rather than an anomaly. A foreigner in a North Korean prison is not something the system was designed to process. You exist in a category that has no paperwork, no protocol, no precedent that anyone here will admit to. You are the problem that nobody knows how to solve, and so the solution, for now, is to leave you in a cell and wait for someone higher up the chain to make a decision. Your cell is 4 meters by 3 meters. You know this because you measured it with your feet on the first day. Concrete floor, concrete walls, a wooden board that functions as a bed, a bucket, a window the size of a paperback novel set so high in the wall that all it shows you is a square of sky that tells you whether it is day or night, and nothing else. You have memorized the sky through that window, across every season. You know what North Korean winter looks like from 4 meters below it. You know what the specific gray of a North Korean autumn morning feels like when it comes through 8 square inches of glass. This is what happens when you have nothing to do. You become an expert in the only things available to you. The food is rice and a broth that has a different color depending on what they have available that week. Sometimes there are vegetables in it. Sometimes there is something that might have been meat in a previous life. You eat everything. You learned very quickly that not eating is a luxury you cannot afford. Your body is the only tool you have, and you need to maintain it, even when maintaining it means eating things you cannot identify with a spoon that has been used by 100 people before you. There are 31 other prisoners in your block. You know their faces, you know their rhythms, you know who cries at night and who has stopped crying because they have moved past the place where crying lives. You know who the informants are. This took you 4 months to figure out, and the figuring out nearly cost you everything. His name was Park. He was in the cell next to yours, and he spoke 17 words of English, which he deployed with the precision of a surgeon. He would press his face to the gap in the wall between your cells at night and ask you questions in his 17 words, and you would answer because you were desperate for connection, in the way that only total isolation can make a person desperate. You told him things, small things at first, that you missed your mother, that you had a dog back home named Charlie, that you were angry, that you were scared, that you didn't understand what you had done wrong. Then one morning, the guards came and took you to a room you hadn't been in before, and a man in a different uniform sat across a table from you and read back to you everything you had said to Park, word for word, translated into Korean and then back into English so you could hear it in your own language coming out of a stranger's mouth. The man in the uniform didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten you. He simply read it back to you, the way a teacher reads back an essay that didn't meet the requirements. And then he stood up and left, and you were returned to your cell, and Park was gone, and you have never spoken to another prisoner about anything personal since. You learned something that day that they don't teach you in aid worker training. Loneliness is a weapon. Not just something you suffer, something that can be used against you. They don't need to torture you with pain when they can torture you with the promise of connection and then take it away. Park was not your friend. Park was a tool deployed against your psychological defenses with clinical precision. And the worst part, the part that still sits in your chest like something that won't dissolve, is that you knew. On some level, you knew. But you told him anyway because 14 months alone will make you reach for warmth, even when you can see the burn. The months pass in a rhythm that has no name. Wake, eat, work detail in the yard if they decide you are allowed that day, return to cell, eat, sleep, repeat. The work detail is the only time you see the sky as more than a square. The yard is a gray rectangle surrounded by walls topped with wire, and there is nothing in it except the ground and the other prisoners and the guards and the sky above it all. There is a woman named Jung in the women's block whose path crosses yours during work detail for approximately 45 seconds every third day. You don't know her story. You will never know her story. But she looked at you once, in the second month, with an expression that contained something you hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. Not of who you are, of what you are. A person in a situation they didn't choose, trying to survive it with whatever is left. That 45-second look has kept you going on more days than you can count. You have thought about it the way people think about photographs of people they love, as evidence that you are real. In the 9th month, something changed. A new guard arrived, young, maybe 22. He had the look of someone who had recently been assigned somewhere he hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet what the rules were. His name, you eventually learned from the sound of other guards calling him, was Ree. Guard Ree did something that none of the other guards did. He looked at you like you were a person. Not with warmth, not with kindness, just with the basic human acknowledgement that there was a person in the cell he was walking past. It was so small a thing that it should have meant nothing. It meant everything. Over weeks, Ree began to do other small things. Leave your food for an extra minute so it was slightly warmer when it reached you. Not rush you during work detail when you paused to look at the sky. Once, in the 10th month, when you stumbled on the way back to your cell and your knee hit the concrete hard, he stopped. He didn't help you up. That would have been too visible. But he stopped and he waited the 3 seconds it took you to get back on your feet, and he didn't move on until you were standing. 3 seconds. You have replayed those 3 seconds more times than you can count. In the 11th month, Ree passed something through the slot in your door with your evening meal. A piece of paper, folded 4 times into a square the size of a stamp. You waited until the footsteps were gone before you opened it. It was a hand-drawn map, rough, imprecise, but recognizable. A layout of the facility, a route, a time. 3 words in English written at the bottom in handwriting that had clearly labored over each letter. Door, dark, run. You held that piece of paper for a long time. You thought about Kang, who disappeared. You thought about Park, who was a weapon wearing a human face. You thought about the man in the uniform reading your words back to you in a flat voice. You thought about the 45-second look from Jung. You thought about your mother. You thought about Charlie the dog, who is probably dead by now, because 14 months is a long time for a dog to wait for someone who isn't coming home. You thought about whether this was real, or whether this was the next level of the same game, whether Ree was another Park, whether the map led to a room with another man in a different uniform and another flat recitation of your own words, whether hope itself was the weapon this time. You ate the paper. You swallowed it in pieces with your water, not because you had decided, because you needed more time, and a piece of paper in a cell is evidence of something, and evidence in a cell gets people disappeared. You ate it, and you lay on the wooden board, and you stared at the square of sky through the window, and you tried to remember the map exactly, the route, the time, the 3 words. Door, dark, run. 2 days later, the power went out at 2 a.m. The facility went dark in the specific total way of a place that has no backup generator on the cell blocks. The darkness was so complete, it had a texture. You sat up on your wooden board and you listened. The sounds of the facility settling into the dark. Guards calling to each other somewhere distant. A door somewhere. Then silence. Your cell door was unlocked. You don't know how. You don't know if it was Ree. You don't know if the power outage was planned or accidental. And you don't know if the unlocked door was connected to the map, or if the universe had simply, randomly, offered you an opening that had nothing to do with any of it. You pushed the door, and it swung inward, and the hallway was dark, and you stood in the doorway of your cell for the first time in 14 months, and the darkness in the hallway was the same darkness as the darkness in your cell. You ran. Not perfectly, not like in a film. You ran like someone who has been in a cell for 14 months, which means you ran badly, with legs that have forgotten distance and lungs that have forgotten urgency. You hit a wall in the dark. You fell. You got up. You followed the map you had memorized and eaten and rememorized in the 2 days since you swallowed it. Left. Right. The door at the end of the corridor that the map had marked with a small X. Stairs going down. Another door. The door at the bottom of the stairs opened onto a service alley behind the facility. Cold air. Real air. Air that had not been inside walls. You stood in it for 1 second and breathed it, and then you moved, because standing still was the only thing you absolutely could not do. You walked for 6 hours through the dark streets of a city you didn't know, in a country that didn't acknowledge your existence, in clothes that had been on your body for 14 months, with no phone, no money, no passport, no map except the one dissolving in your stomach. You walked toward the lights that looked tallest, because tall lights meant the center of something, and the center of something meant the possibility of an embassy, and an embassy meant the possibility of a door that would open for you rather than close. You didn't make it to the embassy that night. You were picked up by 2 police officers 3 blocks away from it, at 6:14 in the morning, as the gray North Korean dawn came up over the buildings and the street began to fill with people going to work. You were sitting on the pavement with your back against a wall because your legs had finally refused to carry you any further. They took you to a different facility, not Facility 7, somewhere cleaner, somewhere with a room that had a table and chairs and a window you could actually see through. 3 days later, a man arrived with a briefcase and a South Korean diplomatic identity badge, and behind him, a woman from the Swiss embassy who had been working your case since month 2, when your organization finally escalated it to a level that produced action. She said your name when she saw you. Your actual name. Not a number, not a foreigner. Your name. The name your mother gave you. You hadn't heard it said out loud by someone who knew you for 14 months and 2 weeks, and it arrived in your ears like something that had been lost and found at the same time. You asked about Ree. The woman from the embassy didn't know who Ree was. You described him. She wrote it down. You never found out what happened to him. You don't know if the map was real and Ree paid for it with something you don't want to imagine. You don't know if the map was a test you passed or failed, or something in between. You don't know if the unlocked door was Ree or chance, or something the universe owed you after 14 months of taking. What you know is that you are out. What you know is that the square of sky through the window of your cell is still up there above Facility 7, and someone else is looking at it now from 4 meters below it. What you know is that Park's 17 words of English still live in your memory alongside the shame of having answered them. What you know is that 45 seconds of being seen by a stranger in a gray prison yard is enough to keep a person alive when everything else has been taken. What you know is that you came to North Korea to photograph the truth and ended up being imprisoned by it. What you know is that you are 29 years old and you are sitting in a room with actual chairs and a window you can see through, and a woman who knows your name, and you are shaking in a way that has nothing to do with the cold. What you know is that somewhere in North Korea there is an old woman who ate rice on some steps one afternoon and had no idea that the foreigner with the camera who photographed her would spend 14 months in a concrete cell because of that single moment of beauty.